Good morning or afternoon, everyone. Welcome to November's webinar sponsored by Society of Product Safety Professionals. We want to also thank Sedgwick Brand Protection, who has sponsored every month's webinars for us, and we appreciate that. And they will also be sponsoring next year's webinars, which we hope you also attend. I am on the board of SPSP, and I am the webinar coordinator, and I'll be doing that next year also. I've been doing product safety for over 40 years, and it's funny how we remember things in our life. One thing I really remember was the first instruction manual I ever reviewed and gave legal advice on, and I was an in-house lawyer at Westinghouse Electric. And we had about a 40-page manual for a pole-mounted transformer, the transformers that go up on the outdoor poles. And I remember sitting with the engineers, going through every sentence in that manual, we were trying to update the manual, and the engineers couldn't even explain to me what they meant by what they said in there. And don't ask me why I remember this. It took 50 hours of my time to go through with the engineers to update that manual so it was accurate, complete, understandable. And it was my first experience with instructions. And I can tell you, over the years I've reviewed instructions are hard to do. They are really hard to write them for people who don't have expertise in the product that you're working on. The consumers or people in industrial settings. And so writing manuals so it is really understandable and complete and you haven't left off a step that you should have in there is not easy to do. And then also adding the safety information that's really necessary, trying to figure out where to put it in the manual, what kind of illustrations you should have. So I think this is a very difficult topic, difficult thing for people to do, and even the professional technical writers, they write good English, but we don't really know what people know and what they don't know who are going to actually be using this product. So in any event, this will be an interesting topic, and I thought we would start off this year. Next year we'll do more, but this year to talk about the standards that have been developed over the years that pertain to instructions and safety information that goes in instructions and other collateral material. So next slide. Here are our speakers. I'm obviously there on the right, Judy Isaacson, Jared France. They're both from Applied Safety and Ergonomics. They are both very active in the standards area within both warnings and instructions, and are both human factors experts. So perfect folks to talk to you about where the standards are and where they're going. And again, next year we're going to deal with some more advanced questions about, okay, so now with the standards and what's going on, now what do we do? Because there are all kinds of interesting questions that we won't have time to get to today. I wanted to mention that these slides and reference material and a link to the webinar will be posted on the website after it's over. So don't feel compelled, because we've got a lot of slides here today, so don't feel compelled to write everything down. You don't need to do that. You'll have those available for you later on. Okay, next slide. So I'm going to give a little legal shtick, as I always do, because I think it's always a good place to start. It's not the end, of course, but a good place to start at least. We'll talk about the standards, talk a little bit about evaluating warnings and instructions, and for the last 10 minutes, we'll have time for questions if you have any. So you'll also have links to contacting us. So if we don't get to your questions or you come up with questions afterwards, you can contact us and we'll try to get you answers to your questions. Okay, next slide. So warnings and instructions are a little bit different. These are definitions actually out of a legal document. And warnings are basically, and usually when we think of warnings, we're thinking warnings that go on the product. But of course, and the ANSI Z535 standards that we've talked about before are usually on product warnings. But we also have warnings in the manual, in the instructions. So instructions are a little bit different, but they include warnings also. Clearly, the law requires a manufacturer to warn and instruct. Next slide. And so I looked at the law on instructions specifically. There's a lot of law on warnings, but not a whole lot on instructions. So I won't say this is everything out there. This is everything that I could find, quickly checking on it. So warnings by themselves, this is from courts, may have no practical relevance without instructions, and instructions without warnings may not be adequate. So you really need to do both. And it's sort of, warnings are going to tell you mostly things you shouldn't do. And if you do them, you're going to hurt yourself. And instructions are going to go beyond that and tell you how to do things safely. So it's a little bit of affirmative versus negative kind of concepts here. And that's so basically what the courts are saying is, well, you really have to do both. Now then, if you have instructions, so what are adequate instructions? Well, these are kind of worthless phrases too. In the court, these quotes are out of case law. Adequate, accurate, effective, clear, complete, and adequately communicated. Well, I guess I would say, shoot, if you complied with that legal requirement, you shouldn't have an accident, should you? Which is the frustration of warnings and instructions. If they were adequate, why did my client get hurt? And the client, the injured party, is always going to say, well, I didn't understand. I didn't see it. They've always got some reason why they did what they did or didn't do what they should do and got hurt. So on the theory that you can always do more, you can always say more, you can always put warnings or instructions in different locations, make them bigger text, use different words, the plaintiffs always have an argument that you could have done better. And the fact that they got hurt is almost, a given fact that they could have been better, and therefore your warnings and instructions were inadequate. So multilingual law and multilingual questions. There's some law in the with warnings, but not with instructions, whether you need multilingual manuals or not in the US. So not a whole lot of help there. And interesting question about when the warning should go on the product or whether it should go in the manual. I don't know if we'll get to that today or not. That can be a subject for our next webinar next year to talk about that kind of stuff. But Jared and Judy will talk about, do the standards say anything about that? So that's what we want to try to focus on. Next slide. So do you have to comply with standards, laws, regulations? Well, mandatory standards, laws, regulations, those adopted by the government, such as the Consumer Product Safety Commission, must be complied with, or you are violating the law, basically. And for CPSC, you'd have to report to them if you violate a mandatory safety standard that they've adopted. Now, even if you comply with this mandatory standard, you may not have a defense in a product liability case. The plaintiff can still argue that you should have exceeded the government standards, that those are a minimum, not a maximum. So even complying strictly with the government requirements is not an absolute defense. Now, the plaintiff would still need to prove that the product, that your failure to comply with the standard proximately caused their injury, was a contributing cause of their injury. So that's kind of a hard thing to prove sometimes. But so the message is, you want to comply or exceed government requirements. Next slide. So voluntary consensus standards are different because they are voluntary. They're not adopted by the government. The ANSI Z535 standards that Jared and Judy are going to talk about are voluntary consensus standards. They have not been adopted by any government agency. Therefore, you don't have to comply, and still you can argue that your warnings and instructions were adequate. But you also can comply, and the plaintiff can still argue that you should have done more. And again, the plaintiff is going to get up there, and the plaintiff's been injured, and they get on the stand and they said, Well, I don't care what standard you complied with. I didn't understand what you were saying. And as you'll see, the standards don't tell you exactly what to say or exactly where to put information. They're giving you formats to help make warnings easier to access and see and maybe understand, but they don't tell you exactly how to do it. So anyway, we also want to comply. We want to think about the voluntary consensus standards. We'll get to the question of, do you need to comply or not? Because it's a lot, the Z535 standards for warnings are a lot easier to comply with than these standards for instructions, because these are a lot longer and more detailed. So we'll talk about that, whether you really need to comply with it or not. I have a certain view on it, which Judy and Jared may disagree with, but we'll talk about that one later. Okay, Judy, I'm going to turn it over to you, and Jared, next slide, and I'll be here monitoring everything. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ken. So we'll get started with just a quick overview of these consensus standards that Ken was just mentioning, the ANSI Z535 series. Currently 6 parts to that, and by the end of this year, we're expecting the new Z535.7 for safety information in electronic media to come out. Next slide, please. The group that develops these standards comes from a range of backgrounds. It's intentionally broad. So currently, Jared's and my colleague Steve Hall is the chair of the Z535 committee. I'm the vice chair, and we work with people with member organizations ranging from manufacturers such as CAT through companies that actually produce safety labels, for example, like Clarion, organizations such as the Human Factors and Ergonomics Society. And we're happy that the CPSC has in recent years been able to officially join the committee. They were involved for many years, but are now officially members of the committee. Next slide, please. So the Z535 standards process has been going on since the roots in 1941. A big jump in 1991 where Z535 1 through 5 came out. So the standards regarding safety labels and safety signs, safety tags. In 2006 was when the first of the standards we'll be talking about today came out, the Z535 for safety information in collateral materials, things like manuals. And now, many years later, we are about to have our next one for electronic media. So things change over the years, takes a while sometimes. Now, back before Z535.6 came out, giving people guidance on how to present safety information in owner's manuals and lists of instructions like that, there was a useful document that came out from the CPSC in 2003. Next slide, please, Jared. Which was the CPSC Guide to Developing Consumer Product Instructions. Ken will be sending out this document after the webinar today. It includes some practical guidance about safety information, presenting instructions, usability, comprehension, evaluation, avoiding overwarning, always important too. It's got a useful summary of the literature. One thing to keep in mind, since this was from many years ago at this point and preceded Z535.6, there are some aspects that are now outdated. So for example, you'll see the definition of caution still includes property damage, which has not been true since 2006, 2007-ish. So you can scan that QR if you can't wait until later and get to the PDF, or wait for Ken to send that out. Next slide, please. So getting back to the Z535 standards, the overall goal across the series of standards, I've got examples on this slide here that are from Z535.6 specifically. The overall goal is, as Ken mentioned, not to tell you what to say. It's more how to present that information, how to format it. The goal is increasing the uniformity in how things are presented, helping manufacturers to develop and provide that safety information. And as Ken mentioned, these are consensus standards. They are not mandatory. They are also not magic. That's something that does come up a lot. It's like, oh, well, if I follow this, then people will automatically follow and read my information, do everything I want them to do. Nope, not true. Using the specific formatting is helpful for all those purposes of the standards, consistency, making it easier to develop things. but there's no guarantees. It's not going to magically make people follow your instructions. There's also not anything particularly magical or special about the specific format. They're selected to be easy to use, etc. But there are many other formats and ways of presenting safety information that would be expected to be, equally valid for your users. Another thing to note with the Z535 standards is that they are superseded by other sources of, other requirements that are mandatory. So for example, regulations that tell you to do something different. You follow the mandatory regulations. An example of that you can see every day in your vehicle is the yellow signal word panel on your visor. That came out of a CPSC focus group many years ago, where they decided, oh, let's use yellow. So we now have yellow, even though it's not consistent with the Z535 requirements for orange. So next slide, please. So then getting on, sorry, go ahead.
That's all right. So for this next section, we're going to talk a little bit about specifically Z535.6. Again, that's the one that's going to cover product manuals and collateral materials. And by way of sort of context and orientation to the standard coming about, we can look at what the world looked like before .6 came to be. And it was common to see myriad approaches to how safety information was formatted to indicate that it was safety information. Here's a few examples here about how signal words are incorporated, safety alert symbols are incorporated, how the text is formatted, etc. And perhaps you were thinking, well, it seems like we have .4, and .4 tells us how we could format something if it goes on a product. Couldn't we just borrow from .4 and incorporate that into our manual? And there's certainly some benefits to having more formatting flexibility with .6. If we just sort of have each box one after another, that might make it more challenging to navigate through the text or support a hierarchical structure, which is fairly common to have in owner's manuals, like chapters, sections, subsections. By incorporating a lot of these boxes, it might be a little bit more difficult to use the document or actually kind of look through the headers. We also see that there's some issues with space and pagination that might come to mind if we use boxes like this. So next, I'm going to show this up pretty quickly. You're welcome to reference the actual standard for the answers here, but things that are included in collateral materials or governed by .6 are going to be our owner's manuals, sets of instructions, and user's guides. Things that are not included would be what's covered by .4, for example, like an on-product label or a product sign, as well as things like audio and video materials, or that are dynamic or electronic. So those were carved out and are now going to be addressed by .7, which we'll talk about a little bit later as well. Another thing to consider is, what is a safety message? How do we know we're talking about something safety related? Well, a common way to look at that is whether the message includes information about the hazard, the consequences not avoiding that hazard, and how to avoid the hazard. That's commonly shorthanded to hazard, consequence, and avoidance information. And it's common for safety messages to include information about each of those three aspects. Although if any one of those three is sort of readily inferred based on the context or the situation, it may be acceptable to omit one of those for ease of reading. So again, I'm just going to leave this up here, and as Ken mentioned, these will be available to you after our talk as well. So next, I think we're going to move over to talking about some different types of safety information that are discussed in .6. We have supplemental directives, grouped safety messages, section safety messages, and embedded safety messages. And each of these is going to offer a particular way of communicating safety messages and to what portions of your instructions is actually going to apply. And Judy, I want to turn it over to you to maybe talk a little bit about the kinds of reading activities people might do with their manuals, for example.
Back when the Z535.6 standard was being developed and those 4 different types of safety information that Jared just mentioned were basically being formulated, the intention was to address the various things that someone might be doing with their owner's manual or other collateral printed materials like that. At any given point in time when, as they're using this document, what are they trying to do? Are they reading to learn? Are they, when you first get the product, are you just reading through that manual front to back? Are you looking for some specific information for, I have this task, I want to troubleshoot this problem. Where in this book is what I need to know about that? Are they skimming? Are they searching, problem solving, etc.? And that really drove some of the formats that appear in .6 and that we'll talk a little bit about today. So a quick example of this, this is a gaze map, basically fixation map from one particular participant in a study that was done with some instructions for a nebulizer as people were following the instructions to complete a specific task. And you can see for this particular participant, each of those numbers represents where their eye had stopped, had fixated on the document. You can see how this particular participant, read on through, got to that warning box, the Z535.4 style warning box, hit on that signal word panel, and then left. Versus a little bit farther down on the page where you can't even see it because it's behind a bunch of fixations. At the lower right, there is actually a note in there underneath all those fixations that gives an instruction, some information. So that type of thing is what guided what you'll hear about in a little bit about embedded safety messages, and including the safety messages right there in the relevant step.
So first, let's look at supplemental directives. So supplemental directives are something that provides an indication that there is safety information somewhere, but doesn't contain that safety information itself. So you might be familiar with seeing something like read this manual, look for another manual somewhere else, store this in a particular place, etc. A few other examples of that would be something like this, where we would have a signal word panel. We would reference another document, read the OEM manual for whatever it is. Maybe there's a name to that particular document that you're talking about. There might incorporate some general consequences there, as well as perhaps some other ways to gain access to additional information. So that's what a supplemental directive is and generally looks like. And Judy, you want to talk about grouping safety messages for a second?
Yep. So the group safety messages, this is what you might call a safety section in a manual. So when you've got that big list of things that you want people to know that often appears near the beginning of a document, it can also appear in a different location if it makes sense. But basically, it provides safety messages in one spot, often messages that apply throughout the process or throughout the time when it would be using the manual, so that things don't have to be repeated over and over. And because these safety messages are grouped together in one section, you often do not have to repeat warning, warning, warning over and over. You can make things a little bit more consolidated. And next slide, please. You can give the whole section a useful heading that people can find in the table of contents. Use subheadings to help direct people. So again, rather than just having warning repeated, you can use useful headings. You can also group the related messages together. You can just go ahead through the end of the call out on that one, Jared. So this is often a spot in manuals where there is a great opportunity to improve what might be existing in your documentations from a usability perspective. Take a look at your safety messages and see how things might group together under particular headings like use personal protective equipment.
Looking at section safety messages, this is similar to group safety messages in that they are often together in a place, but they apply to whatever section is there. So if you have a section, if it's operation, maintenance, or some other thing that you've called it in your instructions, if you have a section safety message, it's meant to apply or be applicable to that section. And therefore it's typically located at the beginning of that section that it's going to apply to. And a common format way that actually looks is here, where we might have a warning beginning under a particular heading. So our heading is going to tell us this is what this section is about. The heading also supports that hierarchical structure of manuals. And we can use things like the signal word panel to indicate that this is safety information, although there are some other ways that are permissible to format this according to .6. A bunch of different ways you can do that. You can use the signal word panel, or you can just use the safety alert symbol. A few different ways that's shown in the standard for justifying text. But in general, a section's safety message is going to be characterized by having a informative header for your section, and then sort of immediately following that, a particular safety message that's meant to govern kind of everything within that section.
Then we get into the finest level of detail, which is the embedded safety messages. So these are the messages that apply within a procedure, for example, to a particular step or another very small unit of information compared to the section safety messages that apply across an entire section. So for example, you might have a maintenance section with section safety message about always wearing the appropriate protective equipment or being trained or similar. And then in a particular step within that maintenance section, you might have, okay, changing your oil. Within there, you may have an embedded safety message. So a few elements of that. If you use a signal word, then it needs to be sans serif and uppercase. You can use an exclamation point rather than a safety alert symbol to just help things flow a little bit more smoothly. So you're also welcome to use a safety alert symbol. It can often depend on your formatting, just what works best for you. As you can see here in this example, the safety message is integrated within that flow of the text. That's to help keep people in what they're doing, in their task. They're reading the instruction, and then here's this message that applies directly to that message. You can use specific formatting such as italics or bold. You can also leave it unformatted. It all depends on the readability of your manual. Here's a few different examples of that, and in the standard itself, you can see some examples. You can use the safety alert symbol, you can use the signal word, you can indent or not. So you have a lot of choices. There's a lot of flexibility written into the standard to help make things work for people across a number of situations.
So I'll leave this summary table here for the slides that Ken's gonna send out, but I think it illustrates that there's a few tools in your toolbox for how you can place safety messages within your instructions, given the extent to which that message applies to different kinds of information, and it feeds into that generally expected hierarchical structure of your manual.
And then the big question.
Yeah, the big question. So, okay, like this is great that you've told me how I can kind of format this, but is it going to tell me what I should say, what I should warn about? The answer to that is no. Instead, I would suggest that standards users consider a couple questions. What is it that you want people to know, and how do you want them to know it? And by considering thoughtfully those questions, that can often help put together both the content and then following with the standard, the kind of safety message you want to use and where it might be placed.
So specifically, the audience comes into play throughout here. Who is this person? What is their background? What are their needs? What are their goals? That also ties into what type of document you might be looking at any given moment. So for example, a service manual might have safety information treated very differently than a general user manual. If you're counting on people to, if you know that the people doing servicing have been trained and already have a baseline of safety knowledge, there's a number of things that you would not necessarily need to repeat. That, on the other hand, if you were talking to a general user, you might want to include. Can also ties into the supplemental directives. There's the supplemental directives that tell you to go read another manual, but there also can be things that tell you must be trained, for example, to do a particular thing. Also consider the purpose of your documents. No, you're fine. I consider the purpose of your documents, and if you are including safety information in catalogs and brochures, then you need to consider in what context those are going to be used, which ties into your overall system of information. So when we use the term system of information, we're talking about all of the things that a manufacturer, for example, is providing to the potential user or the potential audience, all the ways that person is getting information from you, which can be the manual, it can be labels on the product. It can also be things like, as you see here in the car example, a warning light on the dash, that visor label, even the red coloring on the lap belt receptacle. Now that we're in a more online age, that includes the videos that you provide, if you have safety videos, for example. So consider what information makes sense in the particular part of the system of information you are working with. Also consider, is that information consistent with the other locations in which you address similar things?
So I know we've been going through this kind of quickly, but I want to also take a second to kind of look at, well, how can we apply .6 to, if I have an existing manual, what are some things that I could do? A few steps here. One is you could go through and look at your instructions that you have now and just kind of highlight anything that you think might be a potential safety message. From what you've highlighted, verify that these actually have direct safety implications. So we aren't talking about things that are strictly, damage to a component. We're talking about things that have a, potential for injury. So verify that the messages that we've highlighted have safety implications, figure out what kind of hazard are we talking about, what are the consequences of being exposed to it, how could we avoid it? And then that should help you put together the kind of message and figuring out then at the next step where we're going to put that message in our system of information. So is that an on product? Is that in our manual? If it is in our manual, what section does it belong in? Does it apply to lots of different subsets of instructions we have in our manual? That might tell us what kind of safety message we want, one of the 4 that we discussed, and how we want to format it. Then you can put together, well, what's our formatting style for our manual? Do we want to use just the safety alert symbol? Do we want the signal word panel? Are we doing the italicized? Are we doing the bold of the safety message text for our embedded stuff? Whatever it is that sort of fits with your document, you can come up with your formatting style, and then you apply it. So generally speaking, when we look at .6, some takeaways that come out of that are consider taking a look at what you have and whether it's time to update some things, but understand that the standard is going to allow a decent amount of flexibility to kind of suit your needs. So that allows you to choose the formats that you think are appropriate for you, and just sort of expect that the choices you make about formatting, message location, etc., that you may have to explain some of those choices if questions come up down the road.
Then moving on to ANSI Z535.7, the upcoming standard for safety information in electronic media. Very quick background on that. This is something that's been in the works for many, many years now. I think it was first raised in the committee to 2010, 2011-ish. And we had a couple of working groups over the years. Then more recently, we have a subcommittee. You can see here the membership of that has put together the standard that has now gone through balloting, has passed balloting, and we expect that to be published before the end of this year. And a question that comes up is, why now? Or why over the last several years has this been in the works?
And a big reason for that is obviously internet use, digital access is high. It continues to grow. You might be familiar with older sections of time that might have showed a graph of internet use. It's still going up. If you ask the people who are tasked with counting that, they'll tell you it continues to rise. We're also seeing, more mobile phone users, as well as people who are using the internet. So the access is there, people are using it. And Judy's actually recently done some research, some consumer research along those lines as well.
Basically, we did a survey with a couple hundred people, number of people from general population background. So it was an online survey, get that out right now. But it included general population range of demographics. So for example, a third of the participants were older. And they were asked, if you purchased a product, would you expect there to be a manual, like a user's manual? Of those who said yes on each of an array of products we asked about, we then asked them, what do you expect that product manual to be available online? So for example, if you purchased a drill, would you expect that drill manual to be available online? And as you can see here for the drill, the vast majority of people said, yes, I do expect it to be online, or maybe. Only 6% of people not. That was fairly typical across the products. I know that the graphs are too small to read, but you can get the gist of the top one is people that expected there to be a manual with the product. The bottom one is, if there was a manual, would that be online? And you can see that on most everything, that expectation is yes.
This should be more legible once Ken gets the slides out as well.
So a related question, so we have safety information online. Can people get to that? I see already a question rolled in asking about putting a QR code on the packaging. So if you'd asked this question about QRs 10 years ago, would people even be able to access online information using a QR 10 years ago? Not so many. But these days, it's become a very common way of getting to information, very familiar to people. We asked this question, and 91% of the participants reported that they would be able to access an online version of a manual by using a QR code or a URL, although some of them did think that they might need help. So QRs and URLs can get people to online information, whether that's a PDF of your existing manual, whether that's more information in other formats. But one type of safety information that's becoming increasingly common is videos. So we asked also if our participants had ever consulted a video when assembling a product, or if they had ever consulted a video when fixing a product. And as you can see, most participants reported that they had. So a quick practical tip here, slip it in there within our time. You might want to do a search for things related to your product, because there will likely be some videos out there for how to troubleshoot or fix things. If it comes from you, you control what kind of the content is. If it's from other people, you have no control. So you might take a peek and see what's out there and think about that as you're deciding how to provide safety information.
One of the other things we can look to for some of the motivation behind .7's development is looking at what the world looked like in the 20th century pre-Z535.4 of safety signs. And for a while, there were a number of different approaches to the layout, coloring, and overall formatting of information that is sort of meant to be safety related. And you can see here a bunch of different styles that were done, mixtures of colors, different signal words, a bunch of different formatting. And some of the main motivation behind .4 was to say, let's reduce the proliferation of all these different formats and kind of get down to one, so that from one place to another, we have a more consistent way of doing this. And what we can see that is happening in the digital world is something that looks really similar, where it's a lot of different approaches to formatting, the use of different signal words, the use of different safety alert symbols, as it relates to the digital context. And so that also contributed to some of the motivation to incorporate, Z535 components that have been used in other standards for how to visually present safety information into .7. And so if you want to pick up .7 once it's out there, I would expect to see some design aspects you should be familiar with, like which colors are recommended, the kinds of signal words that are used, that safety symbols are permitted. There's also a few other things that are going to be included in there as well, which, Judy, I can let you talk about that a little bit too.
As Jerry mentioned, the overall goal is basically, if you're going to use these elements of presenting safety information, do it the right way. Do it, be consistent with the other Z535 standards in terms of, if you're using a signal word, use the right signal word. There are some other elements of the existing Z535 standards, like what you see there, that become a little bit different once we move online. So for example, for type size, next slide, please. Type size suddenly becomes a little bit more challenging when it is literally in the hands of the consumer, or at least in the hands of their device settings. So if you print a label, that label is the size it is, the type size is the size it is. If it's presented on a cell phone, then the user can zoom in, can zoom out. But on the other hand, if it's HTML and a fixed width that doesn't get automatically adjusted, then sometimes people can get stuck with a size that doesn't work so well for them. Especially if it's, for example, an image of a safety label, for example, things can get more challenging. So that is an example of a concept that is the same, but the actual implementation is a little bit different. Similar to that is durability. So on a label, if you worry about the label getting scratched up or worn off, for a manual, you might give people information in the manual for where to order replacement labels. For digital, we've got a different world of durability. So if you print a QR on a label, then that label needs to be durable so people can still follow that QR. But the other side of the equation, the destination of that QR or URL also has to stay available. So if you've got a label out there and you had a big change in your website and suddenly the original landing page is no longer there, there's a durability issue. So not only plan for the durability of your labels, but also think about how are you going to keep those destination links active.
So as I think is now, it should be pretty clear as we've been discussing the purpose of the previous Z535 standards. .7 is sort of meant to pick up where those standards left off, and is meant to include things that had previously been excluded, like the dynamic media, the audio and the video, electronic media, etc. Which then, I think, again, is going to bring us back to a question many of you may have had with .6, which is, well, is .7 going to tell me what to say? And unfortunately, the answer to that is going to be no once again. But it does bring to mind a few other questions that standard users could consider when presenting safety information online. Thinking about who do we think needs this particular piece of information? Do we know anything about their abilities to, or what do we know about the background of that person? And do we know something about the circumstances under which they need to access it? That may help answer some questions about the appropriateness for any particular communication to be handled electronically or with a particular device, depending on that context.
As with Z535.6, standard gives you some rules about how to present the information, but not the specific details. So now we'll also here in the webinar go a little bit beyond what's actually in Z535.7 and talk a little bit about some of those broader considerations. So for example, the question always comes up, so hey, can I just put things only online? Is that okay? Answer to everything is it depends. As you're deciding what media to use or what information to put in which of various media, be considering the advantages and the disadvantages of those various media. So a few examples up here. So for example, electronic documents or information presented electronically can be readily searchable. that comes in super handy. I don't know if anyone else has been frustrated with your paper manuals with, wait, why can't I keyword search this one thing I want to do? You can always have access to it if you have online access. That's a potential disadvantage. It can be readable in low light, etc. Versus for paper, status quo, it's right there with the product. It's okay if there's no electricity or if the internet is inaccessible or you're not allowed to use your phone because you still have your paper right there. So preferences go both ways, etc. So be thinking about those advantages and the exact situations that you're expecting your users to be needing the various information.
Can I jump in for 1 second here? I mean, one
Sure.
other benefit of the online manuals is that you can then make them available in multiple languages without printing up a bunch of multiple language manuals. Now, of course, you have to translate them, so that's not necessarily easy to do, but it gives more accessibility to those who can't look at. So a lot of benefits of it. And I think generally it's kind of a combination of both online and physical product. And possibly, and again, this will be for our advanced program next year. When do you have a separate safety manual? And then you've got your full manual online. So you do your manual online, have a very short safety manual that accompanies the product. And is that a good idea? Or should you really, have full manuals both ways or something like that? But that's for another time.
And as Jared had mentioned a couple slides ago, a lot of it comes down to your audience and your product, But definitely good to call out that multilingual issue, Ken. It's definitely a huge advantage of electronic to be able to access various languages without having to have a book that's 2 inches thick. One thing to keep in mind, so this also beyond the Z535.7 and into the regulatory world, just as you're developing online information, be aware that ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, does apply. So we're just going to include this here for your reference. Take a quick look at that and be aware of this. Practically speaking, as with the CPSC guide that came out back in 2003 and provides some useful guidance beyond the standards, there exists at this link here a really wonderful resource for online accessibility, the WCAG guidelines, and which will help you conform with the ADA. And also a lot of this is good general usability. So leaving this in here for your reference. And then finally, it's just some quick takeaways on the digital safety information. Digital technology can improve access to and the quality of safety information. People are increasingly expecting to find product manuals and information online. Think about your audience as you're deciding where and how to present safety information online. Be aware we've got .7 coming very soon by the end of the year. Keep in mind those accessibility guidelines and plan ahead, make sure your materials stay available.
Ken, I think I have exactly 1 minute before you wanted to move over to question and answer. So that seems like a perfect time to start another section. I'll go very quickly. And again, the slides will be available, but it can also help think about the how to maybe go about evaluating warnings and instructions. One way to think about this as being part of an iterative process to the overall development of your information. And by incorporating evaluation, that can help add to a manufacturer's story about how that development went. A lot of times evaluation is done with other people. And a particular benefit to doing that might be that it can help make the messages easier to read, maybe even shorter. We can avoid things like critical confusions, and getting feedback from people who have different perspectives, and understanding that others who actually know more or even less about the product or context or situation than you do might help illuminate some ways that your instructions could be adjusted. Kinds of questions evaluation can help answer. I've got a list here. Common ones that we deal with a lot are technical accuracy. So Ken, I think that maybe harkens back a little bit to what you remember to be your first experience putting together a manual with the client, which was like working with the engineers, is what's here even true? That is a form of evaluation, as is things like, can people understand the message? Are we asking them to do a step that is physically possible for them to do? And another one is whether the message is applied consistently across your system of information. So if you have a product with a bunch of different components to that system of information, are your messages being applied consistently across all those circumstances where that message might come up? Sometimes when evaluation might not be needed or is less helpful is if you've been doing something a particular way for a long time with basically no problems. If your messages are adhering to something that's specifically required, if they're simple and easy to understand, or if they're consistent with other widely understood product safety requirements. Which brings us to some general takeaways about evaluation, being that in general, your warnings and instructions are not required to be evaluated, although there's a few exceptions for that in cases of using things like safety symbols under certain conditions. But in general, that's not an expectation. Thinking about more evaluation generally being better, but up to perhaps a point where you're hitting diminishing returns. Just because you have a good evaluation doesn't mean your product will be good necessarily, and that your evaluation could take a number of different forms. It doesn't have to follow any particular one. It could be with users, it could be with experts, or it could be just comparing it against a particular standard. And the other thing I'll add is sort of watch out for relative comparisons, like, well, wouldn't it have been better for us to do this versus that? That's not necessarily the same kind of question as, are either of one or more approaches, appropriate for a particular circumstance. So Ken, I'm going to turn it back over to you for what our upcoming webinars are.
Well, okay, a couple of, one, and it relates to what we're talking about today too. Next month's webinar is on recall effectiveness. I've got a European recall expert, US recall expert, and thankfully and nicely, somebody from the CPSC. And the CPSC, if you're dealing with them, you know that they're trying to improve the effectiveness of recalls. And a lot of what they're trying to do relates to what we're talking about today, because it's really, how do we provide information and get the attention of consumers to either the existence of the recall or what to do about it, using both the internet and social media. And the CPSC has a lot of ideas on what they want you to do. I'm not sure if they're right or not, but they have gotten very interested in it. So that'll be part of this. So really, I mean, a recall message is really part of safety communications. It's a warning and instruction, basically. It's just after the fact, after you have the product. So, and we know that in litigation, the effectiveness, the adequacy of the warnings in a recall notice are judged very similarly to the adequacy of a warning on the product or a warning in the manual. So there's a nice flow to this. One other thing, and then we'll get to a couple of questions here. The two sessions I'm thinking about for next year to follow on today's session would be one to do kind of like an FAQ, frequently asked questions. And I've got a bunch of here right now, but we don't have time to deal with them. But we'll ask you, the registrants or those who are receiving our announcement, to submit questions, and we can just we'll pick the ones that we can answer that make sense, that have an answer beyond "it depends," which most questions have that answer, and have kind of just a wide-ranging discussion about things people are asking about and thinking about. So that'll be one session. The second session is I'm going to have two companies show what they do as far. One is on interactive animations, which people can use off their cell phones to show how to assemble and install products. And it's very cool to see it. It's very interesting to see if it's any better. And then another company that does a lot of safety videos. And these could be safety videos that accompany a product, or possibly safety videos that come up after sale when you're trying to communicate a safety message to your consumers who are having safety problems. So we'll do another session on that because that's much more visual. So we'll have some follow-up to this and see how it goes. So it's me just look at the questions here and see there's one question which talked about controlling the version of the manual that you have. And one benefit of putting manuals online is that you can update them easily. And if that's the only place they are. Now, the trouble is when you update them, either because you had an accident or the CPSC tells you to, or you just got smarter or whatever, or questions are coming in on your customer service line, how do your consumers know that you've updated them? The ones that have had, received the products previously. So you can do that. And I think the online approach gives you a lot of ability to update this information. Trouble is that people who then have a physical manual too, they've got the old version of the manual. So then the question is, well, so how do we update manuals in people's possession? And that's real expensive. We don't want to do that, although they could presumably print off the manual from the website. So there's an interesting question about that I've had over the years, where customers would call and they bought a used product from somebody and that didn't have the manual. So they called the company, and I used to be an in-house lawyer and we made all kinds of power tools. They would call and say, we want a manual for our power tool. Well, which one do you send them? Do you send them the old manual? Well, what year did you buy? What year was this manufactured? Because manuals are going to change over time. Technology is going to change. Your safety information could change, be updated. So then you got to struggle with the question of, do I have to keep all the old versions of the manuals? Do I have to, just do it electronically, or send them an electronic version of the new manual or the old manual? So maintaining control of the version of the manual that you're going to be providing to the consumer gets a little tricky, and something you need to figure out and determine. One other thing is, I did a project one time for a company and used technical writers, and we created a template for a manual, and then they were going to convert all of their current manuals to the new template. But then the question was, well, how do I update? And there was like 100 different manuals. I told them they should have less models of their product, but that wasn't a good answer. But I learned that there is software out there, and Judy or Jared, maybe you can comment on this, where you can make changes in one manual that will also update your other manuals where that information is changed. So version control and content control, when you have multiple manuals involving similar products, do you guys have any thoughts on how do you manage the updates of that kind of information easily?
Ooh, I was with you until you said easily.
All right, then I'll try. I'll take the word back.
No, I think it's a double-edged sword, right? Having those kinds of programs certainly offers some efficiencies when you have a really large product catalog. And one of the things that you might need to take some care with is if you're updating just one particular manual, for a particular hazard, or maybe it's a new feature that exists in one product but not all your other ones, that you haven't upset the apple cart on all the other manuals that you've done. I think no matter which system you use, whether it's one you're describing that can affect change across all printed material, or you're just doing them all a la carte, either way, there's going to have to be some management of the version control when revisions take place. And I think just recognizing and having a process to do that is probably your best bet. But either way you do it, that's going to be something that has to be addressed.
Yeah. Well, okay, we're gonna stop. We got a lot of remaining not remaining questions. Well, there's one more down there, and I apologize, I haven't even looked at it yet. But we're running out of time, so we'll. Jared, would you go to the next slide? I think
Sure.
it's the next slide. I think. Yeah, there we go. All right. These are our email addresses. or the email address generally to SPSP. So if we didn't answer a question that you'd really like to get an answer to, if you could either email the address at the top or any of us, and send it to us, and we can get you an answer. But again, we'll have all kinds of questions that we can deal with next year, and we'll ask you all to submit any further questions you have. So this is the start of a journey, not the end. And this subject is ever changing with technology, and that's a good thing. So we appreciate your attendance today. Thank you, Jared and Judy, for participating. And please refer to the material we're going to post, because there'll be some other material for you to look at, which will hopefully either answer your questions or give you more ideas of questions that you still have. So thank you all very much for attending today, and thank you to Sedgwick Brand Protection for sponsoring today's webinar. Thank you all.
Thank you. And I have to drop off to go do an evaluation. So thank y'all.
Okay.
And Jared, on you.
I think
See you
we're
in a bit.
done.
I think we're wrapped up.